Good morning. So my name is Joe Belisle, and this morning I get to take us through our next installment, week 9 in Kings and Kingdoms, our series going through the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And this morning we're going to be talking about a king named Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, well, he doesn't get the fame and notoriety of kings like David or Solomon. He is nonetheless one of the single greatest kings in the history of the entire nation of Israel. And the reason for that, we're going to see, is that he trusted the Lord and decided to live his life faithfully for him. And as I've been reading and thinking and praying about the life and reign of Hezekiah, preparing for this morning, one thing that keeps coming to my mind is how much the Christian life can at times feel like you're playing outfield in a t-ball game. And bear with me on this for a second, because I'm betting I'm not the only one that's ever felt this way. T-ball, if you ever played, is really largely an infield sport, right? Not many kids can actually hit the ball. Well, not many kids can hit the ball. Not many kids of the ones who can actually hit the ball into the outfield. And so what that means is that when you are playing in the outfield, it doesn't really matter how many times the coach or your parents or anybody else tells you that it's important you're out there and that you got to stay engaged and you got to keep your head in the game and your team is counting on you. Because the reality is, you're out there to pick dandelions and maybe kick a hole in the dirt. And at the end of the day, no t-ball game outcome is ever riding on whether the outfielder is paying attention. And so when I say the Christian life can feel like that, it kind of feels sometimes like Christianity is an infield sport. That the people who really have an impact for the Lord, the people who are really helping people find and follow God, they're the professionals. They're the pastors, they're the ministers, there are missionaries, they're maybe the occasional super gifted evangelist like a Billy Graham sort. But for the rest of us, it can kind of feel like, does it actually matter? Right? Does it actually matter if my head's in the game? Does it matter if I'm here? Does it matter if I'm engaged? Does it matter if my life is actually lived faithfully for the Lord? Because it can seem like no, like that's really not going to change the shape of eternity in any real way. The reason I've been thinking about that this week is just how strong of an example Hezekiah sets for us to the opposite. He shows us by his example just how wrong-headed that mentality is and that there is no such thing as our t-ball outfielder in this analogy. Because what he's going to show us is just how important, impactful, and influential our choices to live faithfully for the Lord can be. So that's what we're talking about today, is just how impactful and influential your choices day by day to live faithfully for the Lord can really be. To get there, to start out, I want to read us the introduction to Hezekiah. In 2 Kings 18, where we're going to be picking up this morning, we get 8 verses of introduction to Hezekiah before we get into the stories about him. And so for us to understand what Hezekiah was about, what he was known for, and kind of how he was summarized, we're going to pick up. So if you got a Bible and you want to open it up or turn it on, it'll also be up on the screen behind me. We're going to read 2 Kings 18, 1 through 8. All right, so he starts off, in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel. And remember here, we are in the period still of the divided monarchy. So when it says king of Israel, it's not talking about the whole nation of Israel, but we have the situation where the 10 tribes in the north broke off from the southern kingdom, and they are called Israel. And then the southern kingdom is called Judah. And so Hoshea, the son of Elah, he is king of the northern kingdom, and Hezekiah is going to be king of the southern kingdom. All right, so in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. He broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him, for he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses, and the Lord was with him. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. How's that for a summary statement? Right? Most of the kings, as we're reading through this book, they get like a little blip. They were this old, they reigned for this long, and they were okay, or they were evil. But Hezekiah, he gets this long 8-verse summary. And this middle verse, I think, really tells us why and why he was such a great king. It says, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. That's why there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him or among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. What made Hezekiah a great king was not that he had this brilliant strategic mind, or that he expanded the territory of Israel, or brought great wealth into the nation. What made him a standout king, such that the author of 2 Kings is going to say there was no other king like him after or before, is the fact that he trusted the Lord fully, and that he gave himself to the Lord. That's why he stands out as this great king, and that's why we're going to be looking to him this morning as an example of just how impactful and important and influential our own choices to be faithful to the Lord can be. Now, you might be wondering how, if I'm saying that it can feel like, right, I'm a T-ball outfielder, not a real outfielder, because I think they matter, but T-ball outfielders, how could Hezekiah be an example to that? Right? If there's anybody who's more of an infielder in that analogy, it's got to be the king over God's people, right? He's got to be like the pitcher. He's somebody really important in that game. And that's entirely fair. But the reason I say he's an example to us is that he doesn't use that authority or position as king to force people to faithfulness to God. He doesn't coerce anybody. He doesn't send his military out to corral people who aren't turning to the Lord. He steps up in faithfulness, leads by example, and the people follow. And that's why I say that he is an example to us. But to see how that plays out, we're actually going to have to leave 2 Kings 18. So the author of 2 Kings, he does this summary snapshot that we just read, and then spends 3 chapters breaking down stories that happen later in Hezekiah's reign. But the author of 2 Chronicles does the opposite. He's got 4 chapters about Hezekiah, and he spends the first 3 talking about just the first 3 to 6 months of Hezekiah's reign. And then the last one summarizing what the author of 2 Kings really focuses on. So between the two, we get this incredible composite picture of the reign of Hezekiah. And it's those stories about the beginning of his reign that I want to focus on, because they're where I see this example for us. And so we're going to hop over and we're going to talk about some stories for Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 29 and 30. So feel free to flip there if you want, if you've got a Bible. I'm not going to be reading them because it's just way too much, but it should be pretty easy to follow along if you want to. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, we are introduced to Hezekiah, and this story that we're about to talk about, he says that it happens in the first month of the first year of Hezekiah's reign, which tells you that this is an important priority. This is one of the first things he does after he takes the throne. But what's just kind of blows my mind when I realize this is that as you get down into the story and you kind of trace a couple of those time markers back, this actually happened, what we're about to talk about, on the very first day of the very first month of the first year of Hezekiah's reign. This means that he didn't even finish warming up the throne before he got up to do this. This was the single most important thing for him to do as a king. Not even his own coronation banquet took precedence over this. And so what he does, he gets up and he goes down to the temple and opens the temple doors. And he calls out to himself the priests and the Levites. Now the Levites were one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they were the tribe that God had set apart to be the intermediary between him and the other 11 tribes. And so the priests were one family of Levites. They were the descendants of Aaron, who was Moses' brother, and they were the ones who made the offerings and sacrifices to God on behalf of the people. The rest of the Levites, they weren't making those offerings, but they had a supporting role in the temple and tabernacle services. So Hezekiah calls these men out who are supposed to be filling this role on behalf of the people, and he says, I want to restore the temple to God. He says, our fathers have been faithless. They have filled the temple with abominations. They have filled it with idols and altars to these other gods, to Baal and Asherah and Chemosh and Dagon and Molech and all of these others. And he says the people are worshiping them. Not only that, but they have fully left off the worship of God. Right? They haven't added these other gods to the worship of God. They have left off the worship of God in order to worship these other gods. And Hezekiah says, I want to restore this temple to God. And in 2 Chronicles 29, it tells us that a handful of these Levites stood up and they said, we're in. It actually names them by name. And it says they gathered their brothers and they spend 8 days going in and cleaning out the temple. Clearing out all of the altars and all of the idols and all of the everything that was in there. But what I want us to realize about these men is that before Hezekiah showed up at the temple, they weren't sitting at home like wringing their hands over the spiritual state of Israel, just longing for the day they could get back into the temple and make these offerings to God. No, they were still filling their role on behalf of the people to take offerings to God. They were just doing it to the wrong gods. These priests showed up to work that morning to make offerings to Baal. But when Hezekiah showed up and he said, I want to take this step, I want to restore the temple to God, they said, okay, and they followed. If he hadn't shown up that morning, they would have continued perfectly content on their way, in their idolatry and on their way to hell. But because Hezekiah took that first step, they were willing to follow and take the second. And they do take it. They spend 8 days clearing out the temple of all of the altars and all of the idols. And at the end of that 8 days, Hezekiah gathers the city officials of Jerusalem, and they come down to the temple with a dedication offering. A handful of bulls and lambs and rams and goats. They make this offering to the Lord to reestablish worship of God in the temple. And when they do, the Levites start singing and praising God, and this evidently causes enough of a commotion that the city, the people of Jerusalem, come and gather around to see what's happening at the temple. And when they're done with this dedication offering, Hezekiah declares, we're back open for business. The temple is back open for offerings to the Lord. So if you have offerings you want to bring to God, not to Baal, not to Asherah, but to God, bring them. And we're told in 2 Chronicles 29 that so many people so excitedly gave that the priests couldn't keep up. Hezekiah had to have the Levites, who don't normally make those offerings, step in and help make the sacrifices and offerings because there was such a generous outpouring from the people. And what's great is we get this little note in there that none of this was coerced. Nobody was feeling shamed into giving a gift. It specifically says that it was from those who were of a willing heart that these gifts came. And what we have to realize again, with the people of Jerusalem, just like with the priests and the Levites, is that Jerusalem was not full of secret God worshipers. It was not full of people who were just setting aside these offerings to the Lord at home, waiting for the day they could take them to the temple. No, these were the same people who were making the offerings to Baal and Asherah. These were the same people who were bringing their children to be sacrificed to Molech, because that's a thing they were doing. These people were fully content in their apostasy and their idolatry on their way to hell, and would have continued on that trajectory if Hezekiah had not stood up and taken that first step. But when he stood up and took that step, and the priests and the Levites said, you know what? We're going to follow. And they took that second, it opened the door for the people of Jerusalem to respond and take the third. And they did. They did in a huge way. In fact, they were so responsive that they decided, we're going to celebrate the Passover. Right? The Passover is one of the most important festivals, maybe the most important festival as far as temple worship is concerned, on the Jewish calendar, and they hadn't held it in longer than they could remember. And so in 2 Chronicles 30, Hezekiah sends couriers throughout the land of Israel, not just the southern kingdom of his domain, but the entire nation, northern and southern kingdom, to say, we want to worship the Lord. Come celebrate the Passover with us in Jerusalem. And we're told in 2 Chronicles 30 that as those couriers went throughout the northern kingdom, they were mocked and laughed right out of town. But a handful of men humbled themselves, it says, and came down to Jerusalem for the feast. Along with them, though, it says God gave the men of Judah a singular heart to do this thing, and they come up to Jerusalem as an entire people and celebrate the Passover. And in fact, they do it with such excitement and such zeal that this 7-day festival, they actually double it, and it carries on to 14 days because the people don't want to stop worshiping the Lord. And at the end of that, when it's time to be done, they don't go home. At least not right away. What it says is the people actually go throughout the entire land of Judah and tear down all of the altars and high places and pillars throughout the land. This, if you were here with us last week, this is what Joel was talking about at the church he went to as a child in Africa. Right, where when somebody would come to know the Lord, they would start a bonfire, and that person would go to their house, and they would gather their idols and their fetishes for worshiping those other gods, and they would throw them in the fire, saying, I'm not leaving myself a plan B. Right? I am in for the Lord, I'm in for Christ, and there is no other idol that I can turn to if he fails me. I don't have that category. I am here for him. And that's what the people of Israel were doing. They went through the land of Judah and they said, we're not leaving a plan B. We are here for the Lord. Our children are here for the Lord. And so we're getting rid of all the others. And we're dedicating ourselves, our families, our people to God. Right? And one last time, I have to call it out. Right? Judah was not full of secret God-fearers. These people, these were the people who built those altars and those high places in the first place. These were the same people who were worshiping those other gods, and they were fully content to keep doing it. And they would have. But when Hezekiah stood up and he took that first step, and when the priests and the Levites followed and they took the second, it opened the door for the people of Jerusalem to take the third, and that set the stage for the people of Judah to respond as well and take a massive step of faithfulness toward God. There is no way that Hezekiah could have influenced all of those people individually. But as each person responded in kind, his influence spread to encompass the entire nation of Judah. And it was not just for a spiritual high of a couple weeks or a couple months or even a couple years. This lasted the entire 29 years that Hezekiah was on the throne. Right, for that entire 29 years, the nation was led back to an unprecedented level of trust and faithfulness in God that was never seen before or after in Judah, which is why our author of 2 Kings holds him up as just this unparalleled king in Judah. And the reason we're talking about this morning is that every single one of us has these people in our lives. Every single one of us has people in our lives who aren't willing or aren't able to take that first step toward the Lord, but who, when challenged, inspired, encouraged by our steps of faithfulness, may be willing to take their own. Right? And this is actually how God designed the church to work. Jesus tells his disciples in John 13, he says, "By this the world will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." It wasn't by their passionate preaching or their persuasive arguments or their hellfire and brimstone threats that the people would know. It was by the way they loved differently, by the way they operated differently because they belonged to Christ. Certainly they preached. Certainly they argued, they persuaded, and certainly they warned people of the coming judgment and the freedom that they could find in the cross of Jesus. But it was not their preaching that got people to stop and listen. It was the fact that they lived differently. And people had to account for that. This is the way God designs the church to work. That's why I say there is no such thing as this T-ball outfielder. Right? Because yes, it may be that Joel gets to stand up here most weeks and preach the gospel and share the message of Jesus with more people than you in a week than you may get to in an entire year or your entire life. But the only reason anybody would show up to hear from Joel is because they have seen something different from you. Because they have seen something different about God's people that makes them say, "Tell me about your Jesus." And what that means is I'm not just talking about the big, obviously Christian-esque decisions, choosing to go across the world as missionaries. Right? I'm talking about the small, day-by-day choices that we make to be faithful to the Lord. I'm talking about choices like when you're at the office and you choose not to participate in the office gossip and to speak kindly of even the most difficult of coworkers. Because Jesus calls us to love others and not slander. Your coworkers are going to notice. It looks different. I'm talking about choices like when you choose to own your mistakes and your failures rather than trying to excuse them or sweep them under the rug, hoping nobody notices. Because we're called to integrity, and Jesus calls us to find our identity in Him and not in our successes. It looks different, and people are going to notice. I'm talking about choices like when you go out for drinks with your friends, and you choose not to get drunk with them, because God tells us not to get drunk on wine, but to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Your friends are going to notice. I'm talking about choices like when you choose to live below your means so that you can have more to give generously. Right? Living in less house than you could afford, driving an older car than you necessarily have to, going out to eat less often than you could afford to go out. Because Jesus tells us to store up treasure in heaven and not on earth. It looks different, and people are going to notice. I'm talking about choices like when you choose not to move in with your boyfriend or girlfriend and not to sleep together until you're married because God says He created sex for marriage and not just for fun. Your boyfriend or girlfriend is definitely going to notice. But when you choose not to live together, so too are your family and friends. It looks different. I'm talking about choices like when you choose to give up your Wednesday nights to teach English lessons to families in Gehenna because we are called to love and serve our neighbors. People are going to notice. Or choices like when you decide to open your house, like a number of families in our church have, to children through My Village Ministries. Right? When their families are in times of crisis, to take care of them and help keep them out of the foster system. Because we are told to care for the poor and the vulnerable and the needy. It looks different, and people are going to notice. When you prioritize getting up a little extra early in the morning to spend time with the Lord, reading the Bible and praying, your children, your spouse, your roommates, they're going to notice. Here's the thing, we don't choose faithfulness to the Lord in order to be noticed, but a life lived faithfully for the Lord cannot help but be noticed. It stands out, it looks different. And when we put our money where our mouth is spiritually, when we step up in that way, it calls other people to respond too. It strengthens, it challenges, it encourages our brothers and sisters in Christ to take their own steps of faithfulness. It shows those who are curious about Christ but don't yet know what to believe that there is a significant reality behind our faith. This is not just words. And it forces those antagonistic against Christ to account for the love and the sacrifice and the good that is done by God's people and in His name. Yes, the big choices we make matter. But so often, the biggest impact that we have on eternity is those day-to-day choices to live faithfully for the Lord. To stand out so that people have to stop and say, what is it that makes you different? To be honest with you, I'm here largely because of that. I took a lot of convincing before I was willing to turn to Christ. I had to study prophecy in Psalms and Isaiah and Daniel and Zechariah and Malachi. I had to look at philosophical arguments for Christianity and for other worldviews. I had to look at cosmological arguments for the existence of God. There was a lot that it took for me to decide to put my faith in Christ. But the only reason I was willing to start that conversation, let alone carry it on for the months that it took, was because I saw something different in the lives of the Christians around me that I could not explain. I saw something different that I didn't have, and I needed an answer for it, and it forced me to stop and say, tell me about your Jesus. I may not be interested, but I have to know, so tell me about your Jesus. And in the time we have left, there's one crucial point that we cannot miss in this. Right? Our choices day by day to live faithfully for the Lord matter in a huge way. But none of us will ever do this perfectly. Every single one of us is going to fail. Every single one of us is going to fall short. And what I don't want is that anybody is sitting here today feeling discouraged and feeling like you've blown it because maybe, just maybe, you have made some less than faithful decisions. Or maybe, right now, you are living in spiritual compromise and sin. And there's this voice in the back of your head saying, you're done. You had your chance to have an influence for the Lord. You had your chance to have that kind of impact, and you've blown it. But what we have to realize is that at times, our choice to turn back from faithlessness to faithfulness can be just as impactful as if we had chosen faithfulness in the first place. We see this from Hezekiah also, and we don't have time to read the story. But in our summary statement, we saw that Hezekiah refused to serve the king of Assyria. He rightly trusted God to protect them from the Assyrians rather than paying tribute to the king. But there was a point at which his fear became more powerful than his faith, and he buckled. As the Assyrian army was closing in on Jerusalem, rather than continuing to trust the Lord, Hezekiah buckled. And he turns to the king of Assyria and he says, I'm sorry, I should never have rebelled. And he actually strips the gold out of the temple. He takes all of the offerings that the people had made to God, and he gives them to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, in this very public display of his lack of trust that God can actually protect them. And that could have been the end of Hezekiah's influence for the Lord. That could have been the end of his leading the people in faithfulness. Right? He had just shown them all how little he actually trusted God when rubber meets the road. It could have been the end, but it wasn't. Because he didn't stay there. Hezekiah repented. He turned back to God. And he said, you know what? I am going to trust you. And publicly, just like he had publicly made this faithless choice, he publicly made the faithful choice and said, God, we are going to trust you again to deliver Jerusalem. And when he made that choice, the people got to see him turn back to God, and they got to see God deliver Jerusalem in an incredible and miraculous way. So our choices, day by day, to live faithfully for the Lord matter. And our choices of faithlessness can spell an end to that influence, but they do not have to, because we have a good and loving and merciful and patient God who is always waiting with open arms to receive us back when we turn back to him, and who is excited to continue to use us to impact and influence the people around us. Right? There are no T-ball outfielders in this game. Right? Our choices, our day-to-day lives, show the world that there is a reality to the God we follow, that there is a very real grace and forgiveness that has transformed us and has made us new, and that is available to them as well. And when God's people step up, when we choose to live differently, it gives a voice to that gospel, that grace, and that love that it would never otherwise have.
Thanks for watching. To find out more about our church, about when and where we meet, about joining a group, about serving on a team, about giving online, you can find all of it at threecreekschurch.com.